I'm going to ask a familiar face to come back on up. So we've got Martin coming back up. He's going to talk to us about creating a framework for valuing a company. Because after all, we put so much time, sweat, effort, blood, tears into making our games and making our games businesses. How do we actually describe that to investors? How do we make sure we get that value? So Martin, over to you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Oscar. So I'm Martin MacMillan. I'm the founder and CEO of Pollen VC. What we're trying to do is basically improve the overall financial literacy of game developers. That's a sort of higher purpose mission. Our day job is providing revolving credit facilities to help them scale. So rather than go out and raise equity to put into user acquisition, we provide non-dilutive debt capital, which can be used to scale up a gaming studio in a very sort of capital efficient way. So we're going to talk about a framework for how to value a mobile gaming studio. So obviously the last couple of years has had an insane amount of M&A activity, and obviously the market's changing now. So what we thought we'd do is come up with some kind of framework components, if you like, that can help arrive at value. Now this may be you trying to value yourself as a studio. It may be VC investors trying to figure out what the next round price is. It may be, of course, primary target really is an acquirer saying, how am I going to value this as an asset? So if we go back to my very first day of being an economics student, the first principle of value is something is worth what someone's prepared to pay for it. There's no point in saying, oh, well, they sold for this, therefore I'm worth that, or whatever. Unless there's someone that's actually prepared to part with cash, then it's just theoretical. So the price is what someone's prepared to pay for your studio. Now, what typically always happens is and we've been in a 15-year bull market. So there's two ways to look at this. You can look at the market-centric methodologies for valuing a company, or you can look at the company-centric. So if you look at market-centric, that's about it's about revenues, it's about EBITDAs, it's about multiples. And everyone will say, well, they sold for 20x or 15x, whatever, therefore I'm going to value myself on the same basis. It's like it's always what happens. And there's some kind of comparables about there as well. So you can, you can benchmark it against different transactions that have happened. The other way of doing it is the bottom up. And typically in times when markets pull back, it's very, very helpful to have a bottom-up case. So this is looking at the company, and this is looking at where the revenue drivers within the company are to actually come up with some sort of defensible base case valuation. So and this is things like cohorts, cash, the ability to generate cash, as well as some of the other intangibles around it. So next statement, everything is a DCF. So DCF is discounted cash flow. It's how companies have been valued for the last 100 years. And it's basically the DCF analysis is like it's looking at all the expected future cash flows that company is going to generate and then discounting them back to a value today. So it might be a 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 year, and you basically say, well, if I had to borrow the money today to achieve all of this, then what would this present value number be? So it basically takes all of these future cash flows back to a value today. Now, using discounted cash flow as a way, a valuation mechanic for seed stage or Series A stage companies just doesn't work, right? And the factor is because there's just too much uncertainty. So you don't know if you're making a $500,000 seed investment. Of course, you expect to make money back. Maybe it's 10 or 20x, but you've got very, very little certainty over that. So I'm not suggesting using a DCF mechanic for valuing a venture capital round or anything at all. At least not until later in a company's life. But where you've got cash flows and particularly metrics around user acquisition, it's a very, very good starting point. And again, what we're trying to do is to create a framework where we've got some tangible value drivers within a business to then argue a defensible value. So number one, existing user cohorts. So the thing to do here is to assume, let's say, that you stop acquiring any users. So organic users, paid users, whatever, you just press stop on all new customer acquisition. And what we're trying to do is to take, there's a classic stacked cohort diagram. So we're saying, let's assume the UA stops here. What do we expect the residual value to be in all of those users? So if it's short LTVs, then it's going to be very short. If it's very long, multi-year franchises, there's going to be a lot of value trapped up there. So what we're trying to do is effectively value the long tail and to say, if we waited until all of this kind of played out and then discounted it back, there's this much value trapped, right to the end of the long tail. So that's number one. Now, the key things that drive that are, number one, historical UA spend. So if you've been spending $50,000 a day for the last 4 years, you've a ton of money that's gone in. It can be a very, very capital-intensive business rather, investing in UA. So the key driver is going to be how much you've already spent invested in those cohorts. And on the other side of it is like, how long will it take for those cohorts to play out? So this is LTV duration. Am I a hyper-casual game with a 30-day LTV? Or am I some kind of mid-core with a 12 to 18-month? Or am I some an amazing puzzle game that people are going to play for 2 or 3 or 4 years before they move on to something else? So LTV duration is super important because that's how much is going to be trapped in the residuals, but also how much you've spent it's effectively putting money into a flywheel. And how long does it take for that flywheel to run out of energy? That's the way to think about existing user cohorts. So the next one is basically the efficiency and the scalability of your UA machine. So your UA machine, the way we always think about it is first of all, figure out, have you got a machine? Can you put $1 in and make more than $1 back within a known time frame? So unfortunately, most people can't, which is where they fall over. But if you do, and you're able to scale a business using paid UA, which is obviously one of probably the primary channel how all these games scale, we want to understand the metrics behind your machine and how good your machine is. Because effectively, what I'm buying as an acquirer, a big part of it, apart from the cash flows from your residuals, is your ability to generate money through paid UA. So if we look at assume this is let's say some kind of puzzle game or something. It's got thinking about a 2-year lifetime value. So I've got some predictability in this. Maybe I've got a year's worth of cohorts already, something like that. You've got a $5 acquisition cost and an $8 LTV. And it takes you're going to break even on that, ROAS break even at about 9 months, and you'll go on to generate a 60% return. So you're going to generate an extra $2 return, but it takes you 2 years to get that return. So you're making a profit. You turn 5 into 8. You're making a $3 profit, which, if you look at it, is a 60% profit. But it takes you 2 years. So if you want to, you could take it back to let's say an annual metric, and so the annualized return on capital here going into this UA machine is 30%. It's pretty good. Now you could look at it on a monthly basis, you could look at an annualized basis, whatever. But as a financial buyer, this is really important to you because it's how efficient is your machine. Because what I'm really doing is I'm buying your machine. So what I want to understand is the return on capital that the machine gives. So in this case, it's giving me a 2.8% per month return on capital, 30% annualized capital. So if I'm an acquirer, I'm thinking, I've got this machine, I can make a 30% annualized return, and that's going to factor majorly into my decision, my valuation decision. The next thing, of course, though, is scalability. How much can I scale that machine until the economics just fall over? So this is just demand economics. And if I'm spending $5,000 a day, but I'm planning to spend $50,000 a day, what's probably going to happen is my acquisition costs are just going to shoot up and the economics break and it falls over. So we have this concept of the machine running at full capacity, which is basically an equilibrium level that you can't continue to invest in. So if we look at just the core demand economics of user acquisition, right? So this is just literally, it's economics 101 planted into mobile advertising. So I look at the LTV as my demand curve, right? And so this is a typical economics 101. So the LTV is my demand, and the acquisition cost, CAC, CPI, whatever you want to call it, is my supply curve. It's my supply of users. Now, what will happen is in any UA scenario, the acquisition costs will slowly, sometimes quickly, spike very quickly. So the rule of thumb there is if you're in a massive addressable market, like a hyper casual type of genre, and you could add 2 cents to your bid and reach another 10 million users or something like that, you're going to have a relatively flat LTV curve. Whereas if you're in something super niche, then as you start to go and look for more users for your game, you just run out of the people that are actually interested in the particular IP or genre of game you're after. So the mechanics of these curves are very difficult, and they're definitely not straight line. And the other thing is they move around every day. So this is why you need to be super on top of the metrics at all times. But if you go back to the valuation argument, again, if you want to be very theoretical about it, a rational studio should want to increase their acquisition spend until those curves intersect, right? So until your acquisition cost equals your LTV. Now, the mistake that some people make, in economic theory, that would just be like, that's the sort of the equilibrium price, right? The mistake that people sometimes make is that they don't factor in the financing costs to get to that. So if you say, well, I've got an LTV of $2 and a CAC of $2, well, the $2 goes out today, but the $2 of LTV doesn't come in for 2 years. So you have to figure out how you're going to finance that LTV cycle in the meantime, because otherwise you're going to be buying, by the time you factor in the financing costs, you're going to be buying unprofitable traffic, which no one's particularly interested in. The other thing is, apologies for being a bit technical in here, but it's the convexity of your LTV curve, right? It's just the shape of the LTV curve. The way to look at it is games that generate quite a lot of the LTV early on and then it flattens off are great, because the cash generation of that game is happening a lot quicker. If I get 70% of my LTV of my LTV back within the first 3 months, and then the other 30% takes a year and a half, that's okay, because the ability to generate cash quickly is good. So anything that you can do within the games to increase the convexity and to increase the revenue generating capabilities of a game in the short term are going to be super interesting. So, and then there's, before we get into the third part of the framework, there's some other stuff to take into account. First of all, in terms of organics, so you're not if you've just got a naturally high level of organic, that's great. That needs to be thought about separately to just the paid UA machine. The way to approach that is to create, like estimates of, if you're acquiring 10,000 new users a day and you're not doing anything for it, then, okay, let's figure out, am I going to presume that goes on for 1 year or 2 years, and I'm going to discount the value of those users back. The second is consider your acquirer's cost of capital. How do they fund themselves in their business, right? So let's say I'm a super cash-rich gaming acquirer, and I have my money in the bank making 1%. I've got $1 billion in the bank making 1% per annum. So if I can acquire your company and I can put money into this user acquisition machine and I'm getting a 30% annualized return from the cash that I've got sitting in the bank, good deal. Unfortunately, that's not sort of the normal way it plays out. But thinking about the other side and what the costs is definitely definitely a good sort of two-way thinking to have. And then, of course, the UA is going to be chopping around. No one's, when we talk about residual cohorts, these are users you've already acquired. You know what the shape of the curve is, and each of those users is at a different stage in that cohort's journey. If you're basing an acquisition on like, hey, if Facebook and TikTok ads don't just stay roughly where they are, we could make $1 billion from this over the next 5 years. Super, super risky. So you've got to factor in some volatility and provide a haircut buffer zone where the economics will still continue to work. Typo, that should be number 3. And then there's basically everything else, right? And I'm being, like we could do a whole presentation on all of these, on each one of those different factors, right? But here, because I'm thinking through a financial mindset, not like well, if this happened, then that could happen, then it would be worth $1 billion. I'm trying to get really, really tangible, therefore financial components in the framework. So number 3 is basically lumping in everything else. First of all, first-party data. So if I've already got 10 million users that I can then cross-promote, that's going to save me user acquisition costs from an existing portfolio, there's a tangible value in, so that should absolutely go into the mix. Team and culture. Everyone goes on about team and culture, right? Everyone loves a great team, great culture. The reality is, if you're a financial buyer, what you need is that team and great culture to deliver the rest of the LTV that you've just acquired, the stream of cash flows, right? Might be a little bit controversial, but there are not that many teams out there who are just able to just knock out, hit games time and time again. Some of the biggest guys have not had big hit games for years, which is why they invest and they acquire other companies. So past performance is not an indicator of future success, right? I'm not dissing the teams. Everyone likes a good team, but it's a part of it makes it very hard to ascribe a value to. Brand presence, do you have a good brand reputation? All of these things are like halo effects that are going to help justify and talk up a valuation. One thing that's definitely there is if you've created intellectual property, if you were part of a multi-billion-dollar franchise, is there then the expertise to take the IP that you've created and to go and make a film from it, or just merchandising in other verticals, or leverage that IP because you got acquired by someone who's got ability to help you monetize that. Non-content IP. So this is kind of an interesting one. So many companies build their own tools to fix a problem that they have themselves. It may be automating bidding for user acquisition or something like that. So look for identifiable nuggets of non-content intellectual property that could be potentially commercialized or sold, or what we're looking for is just different ways to justify value. So sometimes, look, Slack was an internal tool, I think for a gaming company before they realized, that the real value is in the messaging tool, right? Ongoing content creation costs, right? So this is like, if I'm valuing my company based on this sort of stream of expected users, the number one way to get your LTVs to fall off a cliff is to stop having enough content for them to play until those are all required. So you need to think about, what you need from a content and a live ops to actually support the delivery of that LTV. And then last one, player behavioral trends. What's going on in the market? Is your, are you in a market which everyone's loving, or they're sort of leaving the genre and going to look for something else? So sorry to be a bit disingenuous and to lump all of these very important things into one slide, but essentially when we're looking through this financial lens of trying to create our framework, these are much harder to value from a financial point of view. So go back to typos made into this slide too. So number one is your existing users. If you press stop and did nothing else today, what are they worth by the time it pans out? Secondly, what kind of machine am I buying? What's your ability to generate money through paid user acquisition using that machine, and how much can you scale it? And then 3, let's look for different pieces of tangible value within our business and try and figure out something that is defensible and ascribe some kind of monetary value to. So that was it from me. It's just a different way of looking at it, but I think as the markets turn and the free-flowing venture capital, as well as just like very frothy valuations for gaming studios, then hopefully there's some sort of tangibility here into trying to ascribe value. So we've got about a minute and a half left. I don't know if anyone's got any questions.
I forgot I left the mic at the back. Sorry, did anyone have any questions for Martin? I'll ask one. I mean, one of the issues I think a lot of companies have when they start out is that they haven't got the game live yet. They're trying to find funding, they're trying to get proof. Some people are trying to find equity for that rather than maybe a publisher for that funding. They don't have a lot of the information yet. Is it okay for them to use, for example, the limited quality like Reflections, App Annie, whatever, or mobile or Steam Spy on other platforms? Is it okay to use that kind of data to provide some level of evidence, or do they actually need to get out and do, for example, CPC testing on Facebook?
I mean, look, here we're talking really about a way of value an establishing company that's looking to sell.
Yeah.
So this is absolutely not for kind of seed stage or even Series A stage, because there's so much uncertainty, you've nothing to value. So really all of this conversation is about well-established, probably most likely venture-backed companies that have done a seed and a Series A, and they've got these metrics, and they've either scaled up or they're operating at scale, whatever. So this is really companies coming out the other end of the
absolutely. I totally understand that, but I think you've got a lot of companies who are starting in that journey. Are there lessons you think from where they need to get to is all the stuff that you've been talking about, that they can apply to that earlier stage?
I think they can, tracking all the data and understanding why that data is super important. So particularly, and however well you can do attribution, all these things really early on, because these are the signals that you can then use in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time to justify the value. So I think the principles that we're talking about, it's useful for people to have them, even if they're at a very early stage, because what you're trying to do is, rather than just sort of come out with something sort of super ethereal about what's going to happen in the future. Say, okay, that might all well happen, but these are the things I'm working on now because these are the tangible value drivers within my business now.
And I think that's really, you've nailed what I was trying to angle at, which is that as we're starting, even if you don't think you're this company that Martin's talking about that's about to exit and is trying to scale and work out what their value is, you've got to be thinking in this way. You've got to be thinking about what milestones do I need to hit in order to make my game successful. And even if you're not necessarily thinking about your valuation and your exit, I think you still need that information. You still need that for yourselves. Because how do you know you're actually being successful if you're not using the same metrics that some external party will value on later anyway?
Yeah, I think it's just good financial hygiene and founder discipline to be trying to understand things the way that a potential acquirer is going to look at it.
And I think that really taps into the sort of type of financing that you're doing to support teams anyway, because I think that this whole idea of, I don't want to use the word factoring, it's the right word, but this whole idea of unlocking finance based on the performance of games is absolutely game-changing, in my opinion.
Well, what we're seeing right now is, as the sort of the free flow of venture capital is switched off, the founders are much more, we sort of preach this idea of capital efficiency using different forms of financing. So we've seen quite a big uptick in business recently from companies that said, you know what, I want to keep my VC money in the bank, and I'm going to look for different ways of funding my acquisition. And that's just that's just an argument around capital efficiency.
Yeah, and as a publisher, we've taken that completely to heart, and our whole business strategy is based on stuff that Martin was talking about 4 years ago. Anyway, a question in the back. Sorry, good.
Thank you very much. I was curious, if you have a product where you're maybe running a subscription model or something where your LTV is linear and not, potentially an exponential curve, do you feel like, aside from factoring in what your churn rate is to actually establish a real LTV for your customer who theoretically could pay forever, but essentially will probably leave at some point, are there any other tricks or tools that, as someone, if you're working with that kind of a business model, you should be incorporating into that chart that you had of LTV versus UA cost?
Look, subscription and SaaS business is going to be great because they literally can be multi-year. What you'd want to do is to have, how long are you going to call it for? You look at your churn rates and so on. You can't say, hey, I'm going to do this over the next 20 years because the entire market is, but do you do it over 3 years or 4 years? But totally valuable if you can show that you've got multi-year, if you've got enough data to support it. If you haven't done one 12-month cycle, it's very difficult to predict 5 years of behavior, right? But if you've been going for 2 or 3 years and showing that people have been there. I mean, we're working with a company who's got cohorts that are 6 or 7 years old. There's a lot of residual value trapped in that, and guess what? There's a lot of value that they can unlock. So most of what we're looking at is like free to play, like a single shot. But yeah, if you've got subscription, then it just basically just juices the LTV for longer.
It's why we focus on living games, because it's like compound interest in many ways. If you are able, and we have yet to prove that, we're not at the stage where we can do Martin's calculation, but if we're able to prove that we can sustain audiences over the long term across multiple games and create cross-promotion across that, that's the accelerator.
I actually use the farming analogy.
Yeah.
So you've got let's say you've got hyper-casual, 30-day, that's basically like farming salad greens or something. The worst that can go wrong is your hydroponics switch off, whatever, and you lose the crop. You get your crop to market in 30 days. If I'm building some merge game that's got like a 1 year or 15-month time, and then I'm expecting people to play, it's like farming sugarcane or something.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that can happen to that crop before the ultimate LTV is delivered.
Yeah, which is why we spend so long before we announce games. Anyway, on that note, I think we're done for questions. So I'm going to say thank you very much for Martin, not only for great talk and a great panel earlier, but also because Pollen were the sponsors of this section, the CFO Insight section. Thank you very much, Martin.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Cool.